The city of Portland's downtown district pulsed with tension on that humid July evening. Vice Governor Marcus Reed stood on the third-floor balcony of the Maxwell Building, his hands gripping the iron railing as he watched the growing crowd below. The streetlights cast long shadows across the faces of hundreds of protesters who had gathered after the latest incident of police brutality went viral on social media. Reed wore plain clothes, a gray hoodie and jeans, having deliberately avoided his usual suit and tie. At 52, his salt and pepper hair and weathered face usually commanded immediate respect, but tonight he wanted to observe without the weight of his office. The choice would prove fateful. Chants of "no justice, no peace" echoed off the building facades. Reed noticed how organized the protesters were, moving in coordinated groups with designated marshals wearing yellow vests. This wasn't chaos, it was structured dissent. Signs bobbed up and down in the sea of people. "Defund the police," "Black Lives Matter," "System change now." The first flashbang grenade exploded at 9:47 p.m. Reed checked his watch, making mental notes of everything he witnessed. The percussion rattled the windows of nearby buildings. Through the resulting smoke, lines of riot police emerged, advancing in formation. Their black tactical gear and face shields created an ominous wall moving toward the protesters. Reed descended to street level, driven by an instinct to witness events firsthand. The smoke burned his eyes as he navigated through the crowd. A young woman stumbled past him, coughing from tear gas. He helped her to her feet, but before he could ensure her safety, the situation deteriorated rapidly. The police line surged forward without warning. Reed raised his hands, attempting to identify himself, his voice competing with the cacophony of shouting and sirens. "I'm Vice Governor Reed! Stand down!" But his words were lost in the chaos. A police officer, badge number obscured, shoved him backward with a riot shield. Reed fell hard onto the asphalt, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Before he could recover, 3 officers surrounded him. One swung a baton, striking his ribs. Another kicked his legs. Pain exploded through his body as they continued their assault, deaf to his attempts to identify himself. 20 feet away, Sarah Chen, a local news photographer, captured everything. Her camera's rapid clicks immortalized each moment of the vice governor's beating. The images would soon become symbols of everything the protesters were fighting against: the indiscriminate use of force, the lack of accountability, the broken system. The assault lasted 47 seconds. When it ended, Reed lay on the ground, his hoodie torn, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. Finally, a senior officer recognized him. The response shifted instantly from aggression to panic. "Oh shit, it's Reed. Get medical here now." As paramedics rushed to the scene, smartphones throughout the crowd had already begun uploading videos and photos. Within minutes, social media exploded with the news. The vice governor of the state had been beaten by the very police force he helped oversee. The irony was lost on no one. The harsh fluorescent lights of Portland General Hospital's VIP wing cast an artificial glow over Marcus Reed's bruised face. The heart monitor beeped steadily, marking time in the otherwise quiet room. His medical chart detailed the damage: 3 cracked ribs, a mild concussion, multiple contusions, and a sprained wrist. The physical pain was constant, but it was the psychological impact that kept him awake. Governor Elena Carter's heels clicked against the linoleum floor as she entered the room at 8 a.m., her normally composed demeanor showing cracks of concern and political calculation. She wore a navy blue suit, carefully selected for the inevitable press photos that would follow her visit. The bags under her eyes suggested sleepless nights dealing with the fallout. "Marcus," she said, approaching his bedside, "how are you holding up?" Her voice carried genuine concern, but her eyes darted to the window where photographers had gathered outside the hospital grounds. Reed adjusted himself in the bed, wincing. I've been better, Elena. But we both know this isn't about my injuries. He gestured to the muted television showing footage of his beating, playing on repeat across every news channel. Carter sank into the visitor's chair, her shoulders tense. The police union is in damage control. They're claiming it was dark, that you resisted. She stopped as Reed's expression hardened. We both know that's bullshit, he interrupted, his voice steady despite the pain. I identified myself clearly, multiple times. This isn't about me anymore, Elena. This is about every person who's ever been subjected to this kind of treatment without the privilege of a title to protect them. Outside, the crowd of protesters had grown since dawn. Their chants filtered through the triple-paned windows. Justice for Reed, justice for all. Signs bearing his bruised face from the incident photos were held high, already transformed into symbols of resistance. Carter moved to the window, watching the gathering below. The police chief wants to meet with you, to apologize personally. The mayor's office is calling every hour. The press is demanding statements. She turned back to Reed. We need to manage this carefully. Manage? Reed's laugh turned into a grimace of pain. That's exactly the kind of thinking that got us here. This isn't a PR crisis to manage, Elena. This is an opportunity for real change. He pushed himself to sit straighter, ignoring the protest from his ribs. I've spent years in office, making compromises, playing it safe. But lying in this bed, I keep thinking about all the people who didn't have cameras recording their assault, all the voices that were ignored. The television showed split-screen coverage, one side showing Reed's beating, the other showing live footage of the growing crowd outside. The contrast wasn't lost on either of them. Carter watched her longtime colleague and friend with growing concern. What are you planning, Marcus? What I should have done years ago, he replied, his voice gaining strength. I'm going to use this platform, not for political gain, not for revenge, but for actual reform. The system didn't just fail me, Elena. It's been failing people for generations. The gravity of his words hung in the air, interrupted by a nurse entering to check his vitals. Through the window, the chants grew louder, a reminder that this private conversation had very public implications. Maya Johnson's small apartment in East Portland felt suffocating as she watched the footage of Reed's beating for the 20th time. Her hands trembled around her coffee mug, the liquid long since gone cold. The scene playing out on her laptop screen was disturbingly familiar, too familiar. 2 years ago, she had watched similar footage of her brother Marcus being beaten by police. The only difference was that her brother hadn't survived. The 26-year-old activist sat cross-legged on her worn couch, surrounded by protest flyers and social media printouts. Her phone buzzed constantly with notifications from the various advocacy groups she led. Everyone wanted her take on the Reed incident. Everyone wanted direction. The timestamp on her laptop showed 3:47 a.m., but sleep wasn't an option. This time it's different, she whispered to the framed photo of her brother on the coffee table. This time they can't sweep it under the rug. Her fingers moved across her keyboard, drafting another post for her 50,000 followers. When they beat my brother, they called him a threat. When they beat Vice Governor Reed, they called it a mistake. The only mistake was thinking they could keep doing this without consequences. Justice for Reed. Systemic change. The post went viral within minutes. Maya's phone rang. It was Jerome, her fellow activist and closest friend since the loss of her brother. Girl, you seeing these numbers? Your post is everywhere. CNN just picked it up. Maya's voice was steady, determined. We need to mobilize, Jerome. Not just the usual crowds. This is our moment to bridge the gap. When they beat Reed, they beat everyone who's ever faced police violence. Black, white, doesn't matter. They showed their true colors. She spent the next hours coordinating with other activists. creating a coalition that transcended the usual political and racial divides. Her apartment became a virtual command center, with Zoom calls connecting activists across the state. The walls of her small living room disappeared behind newly printed posters featuring split images, her brother's face beside Reed's bruised one. At dawn, Maya began writing her letter to Reed. The words flowed naturally. "Dear Vice Governor Reed, you don't know me, but we share something now. 2 years ago, my brother Marcus died after a similar encounter with police. The same force that attacked you ended his life. The same system that's now apologizing to you ruled his death justified. I don't write this with bitterness, but with hope. Your position gives you a platform my brother never had. Your voice carries weight that his final screams did not. I lead a coalition of activists who have been fighting for change, and we stand ready to support you. This isn't just about police brutality. It's about a system that decides whose pain matters and whose doesn't. Your experience, terrible as it was, has created a bridge between worlds that rarely intersect. You now stand in both, the corridors of power and the streets where we fight for justice. My brother can't speak anymore, but I can. And now, so can you. With a perspective few in your position have ever had, we're organizing a peaceful demonstration next week. I would be honored to meet with you, to share our stories and our vision for change. Your bruises will heal, Vice Governor Reed, but the system that caused them doesn't have to remain broken. In solidarity, Maya Johnson." She sealed the letter, knowing it would likely be one of hundreds Reed would receive. But something told her this connection was different. The universe had a twisted way of bringing people together, of forcing change through shared pain. The Internal Affairs conference room felt like a pressure cooker. Officer James Carter, badge number 6382, sat rigidly in his chair, facing the investigation panel. The room's stark fluorescent lighting highlighted the sweat beading on his forehead. 3 cameras recorded every moment, a direct result of new transparency protocols implemented after Reed's assault. "Officer Carter," began Chief Investigator Sarah Martinez, her voice clinical and precise. "Walk us through the events of July 15th, starting with the command structure during the protest response." Her pen hovered over a legal pad, though everything was being digitally recorded. Carter's throat bobbed as he swallowed. 12 years on the force, and now he sat on the wrong side of an investigation that had captured national attention. His union representative shifted uncomfortably beside him. "We received orders through Captain Richards," Carter began, his voice slightly hoarse. "The directive was clear: maintain order at all costs. We were told that any sign of weakness would encourage more protests." He paused, glancing at his hands. There was pressure, intense pressure from above. Martinez leaned forward. "Define pressure, Officer Carter." 2 weeks before the incident, we had a closed-door meeting. Deputy Chief Williams told us that our careers depended on controlling these protests. He said, and I quote, "If we lose the streets, we lose everything." Carter's words hung in the air like smoke. The investigation panel exchanged glances. Deputy Chief Williams, conspicuously absent, had called in sick for 3 straight days. "Continue," Martinez prompted. "The night of the protest, we were told that any aggressive protesters should be—" Carter hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Dealt with immediately. No warnings necessary. They showed us social media posts claiming outside agitators were planning violence. We were pumped up, told we were the thin blue line between order and chaos." The revelation sparked immediate reactions. One panel member furiously typed notes. Another closed his eyes, processing the implications. Martinez maintained her professional demeanor, but her knuckles whitened around her pen. "And Vice Governor Reed, when he identified himself?" Carter's face paled. "With the noise, the chaos, We couldn't hear clearly. But that's not the whole truth. He straightened in his chair, something shifting in his expression. We were conditioned to see threats everywhere. Our training emphasized force over communication. When someone resists, we escalate. That's the culture. That's what they drill into us. The admission sent ripples through the room. Even Carter's union representative looked stunned. What do I tell them when the system I served turned me into exactly what the protesters claimed we were? The testimony leaked within hours, despite confidentiality protocols. News channels ran headlines. Officer reveals culture of violence in police force. Social media exploded with clips of Carter's testimony. Police unions across the state scrambled to damage control, but the revelation sparked a broader debate about police training and institutional culture. By nightfall, Carter spoke and Onch's systemic change trended nationally. The thin blue line had cracked, revealing the pressures and practices that had led to countless incidents of brutality. Officer Carter's testimony wasn't just about one night or one beating. It was an indictment of an entire system. The press conference room at the state capitol buzzed with anticipation. 2 weeks after his assault, Marcus Reed approached the podium, his injuries still visible but healing. The room was packed beyond capacity, local reporters shoulder to shoulder with national news crews, all cameras trained on the vice governor's face. Reed adjusted the microphone, his movements careful and deliberate. His usual political polish was gone, replaced by something raw, more authentic. He wore no tie, his collar open, his bruises deliberately uncovered. Each mark told a story he wanted America to see. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "I'm not here to talk about my recovery. I'm here to talk about a disease that's infected our law enforcement system. 2 weeks ago, I experienced what thousands of Americans have faced, the unrestrained power of a militarized police force. The only difference is that my title forced people to pay attention." Across town, Maya watched the press conference on her laptop while coordinating with activists through multiple chat windows. Her social media command center had expanded, now occupying a donated office space. Volunteers managed different platforms, amplifying Reed's words in real time. "Look at these photographs," Reed continued, as images appeared on the screen behind him. "This is me, 2 weeks ago. And this," he pointed to another image, "is Marcus Johnson, who died in police custody 2 years ago. This is Sarah Martinez, beaten during a traffic stop. This is David Chen, paralyzed during a routine questioning. The only difference between their cases and mine is that I survived, and I have a platform." Maya's hands froze over her keyboard. Her brother's case, mentioned by the vice governor on national television. Her phone exploded with messages, but she couldn't look away from the screen. Reed's voice grew stronger. Officer Carter's testimony revealed what many have long suspected, that these aren't isolated incidents, but symptoms of a systemic problem. We've created a police force trained to see enemies instead of citizens, taught to dominate rather than protect. The hashtag #ReedSpeaks shot to #1, trending nationally. Maya's team coordinated with groups across the country, organizing simultaneous demonstrations in 30 cities. The momentum was building, a wave of public consciousness that couldn't be ignored. "I'm announcing today the formation of the Civil Rights and Police Accountability Commission," Reed declared. "This independent body will have full investigative powers and civilian oversight. But more importantly, I'm joining hands with grassroots organizations who've been fighting this battle long before my incident." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "To Governor Carter and our state legislature, the time for half measures is over. We need comprehensive police reform, not band-aid solutions. To law enforcement officers who want change, we welcome your voice. And to those who've suffered in silence, your voices will be heard." The press room erupted with questions, but Reed held up his hand. One more thing. To Maya Johnson, whose brother's death should have been our wake-up call 2 years ago. Your letter moved me deeply. I'm ready to work together. The bridge you spoke of? Let's build it. Maya sat back in her chair, tears streaming down her face. Her phone rang. It was Reed's office, asking if she could meet with him tomorrow. Outside her office window, she could see people gathering, signs being raised. The movement she'd helped build was transforming from a protest into a revolution. Governor Carter watched the press conference from her office, her expression unreadable. On her desk lay polling numbers showing overwhelming public support for reform, alongside worried messages from police union representatives. The political landscape was shifting beneath her feet, and she had a choice to make. Governor Elena Carter stood at the podium in the state capitol's main chamber, facing a divided audience. On one side sat police union representatives and conservative legislators, their faces tight with disapproval. On the other, reform advocates and progressive lawmakers leaned forward expectantly. The tension in the room was palpable. Today, Carter began, her voice firm, I'm introducing the Comprehensive Law Enforcement Accountability and Reform Act. She gestured to the thick document being distributed. This legislation will fundamentally restructure how we train, deploy, and oversee our police forces. The key points appeared on screens throughout the chamber. Mandatory de-escalation training, independent civilian oversight board, ban on military-grade equipment, body camera requirements with automatic activation, end of qualified immunity, reallocation of 30% of police funding to community services. The police union president, Frank Morrison, immediately stood up, his face reddening. Governor, this is a direct attack on law enforcement. You're crippling our ability to maintain order. Carter held her ground. Mr. Morrison, when my vice governor can be beaten on our streets, order has already broken down. This isn't an attack. It's a rescue mission for the integrity of law enforcement itself. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Reed and Maya Johnson sat in a community center, surrounded by activists and reform advocates. They were planning what would become the largest civil rights demonstration in the state's history. Maps covered the walls, showing march routes and assembly points. We need to maintain absolute discipline, Maya emphasized, addressing the group. They're waiting for us to slip up, to give them any excuse for a crackdown. Every marshal needs to be trained in de-escalation. Reed nodded, adding, and we need to be ready for counter-protesters. The police unions are mobilizing their supporters. They're painting this as an attack on public safety. The tension wasn't just in meeting rooms. At the Central Police Precinct, a different kind of gathering was taking place. Officers crowded the break room, watching Governor Carter's speech with growing anger. Captain Richards paced the room, his phone constantly buzzing with messages from other precincts. They're throwing us under the bus, Richards fumed. First Carter betrays us, now they want to gut our funding, take away our protection. This isn't reform, it's surrender to the mob. An officer spoke up from the back. What about a sick-out? Show them what happens when we're not around. The suggestion sparked murmurs of agreement. Richards held up his hand. We need to be smarter than that. The unions are organizing a response. When these protesters march, we'll show them why they need us. By the book, but no extra effort. No courtesy warnings, no flexibility. Let's see how their reform works in real time. Back at the Capitol, Carter faced mounting pressure from both sides. Her political allies were splitting into factions. Conservative donors threatened to withdraw support. Police unions announced plans for a vote of no confidence. In her office after the announcement, Carter received a call from the state's largest police union. Governor? The union leader's voice was cold. You've made your choice. Now we'll make ours. When the streets explode into chaos, remember who you sided with. Maya's network of activists intercepted messages suggesting police were planning to deliberately slow response times in protest neighborhoods. Reed's security detail warned him of increasing threats from both extremist civilians and disgruntled officers. The city crackled with tension. Store owners boarded up windows, remembering previous protests that had turned violent. Community organizations stockpiled medical supplies and water, preparing for potential confrontations. The anonymous email arrived in Marcus Reed's inbox at 2:37 a.m. "Back off, or your beating will look like a warm-up. Some lessons need to be taught twice." Similar messages flooded his social media accounts, each more explicit than the last. His security detail, already enhanced after the assault, recommended canceling all public appearances. Reed sat in his home office, the glow of his computer screen illuminating the lingering bruises on his face. His daughter had called earlier, begging him to step back from the movement. "Dad, they're not going to stop at threats," she'd warned. But as he scrolled through messages of support from victims' families, he knew retreat wasn't an option. At Maya's organizing headquarters, the atmosphere was equally tense. She'd received her own share of threats, but these were familiar territory. She'd been getting them since she began advocating after her brother's death. The difference now was the scale and coordination of the intimidation. "They're trying to fracture us," Maya addressed her core team, spreading out intelligence reports gathered from sympathetic officers and community sources. "The police unions are coordinating with right-wing groups. They're planning counter-protests at every location we've announced." Reed arrived for the emergency strategy meeting, his security detail scanning the room before letting him enter. The space was secure, swept for devices, phones collected at the door. Around the table sat representatives from various civil rights organizations, community leaders, and a few reform-minded police officers who'd risked their careers to help. "They want us to back down," Reed began, placing a folder of threat assessments on the table. "Every message, every intimidation tactic is designed to make us question whether this is worth it." A young activist spoke up, fear evident in her voice. "Maybe we should postpone, just until things cool down." Maya stood, her presence commanding attention despite her youth. "That's exactly what they want. Every time we've postponed, every time we've waited for the right time, more people have died. My brother died because previous movements backed down. Marcus was beaten because we haven't pushed hard enough for change." The room fell silent as she continued. "They're threatening us because we're winning." Officer Carter's testimony cracked their wall of silence. "The governor's reform bill has them scared. Public opinion has shifted. We can't stop now." Reed nodded, adding, "I've been in politics long enough to know when the opposition is desperate. These threats, they're not signs of strength. They're proof that the old system is dying, and they know it." The meeting continued into the night. They refined their strategy, planned contingencies, and strengthened their security protocols. Every threat was documented, every potential scenario gamed out. The demonstration would proceed, but with additional safeguards, multiple demonstration routes planned to be announced last minute. A network of legal observers and medics, live streaming from multiple angles, coordination with sympathetic officers for intelligence, emergency response teams on standby. As the meeting concluded, Reed pulled Maya aside. "Are you sure about this? You've been fighting this fight longer than I have. You know the risks." Maya's response was unwavering. 2 years ago, when they killed my brother, I promised his son that I would make sure his death meant something. Every threat, every intimidation attempt just proves we're on the right path." The city buzzed with tension as the day of the demonstration approached. Police departments across the state reported unusual patterns of officers calling in sick. Social media exploded with competing narratives and calls for action. The governor's office received warnings of potential violence from both sides. In their own ways, both Reed and Maya knew that the next 48 hours would either break their movement or change history. Dawn broke over the state capitol, revealing a city transformed. The massive crowd stretched beyond what any organizer had predicted. Early estimates suggested over 100,000 people. The steps of the Capitol became a sea of signs, banners, and raised phones, broadcasting live to millions across social media. Marcus Reed and Maya Johnson stood at the top of the Capitol steps, surveying the gathering crowd. The organization was impressive. Clearly marked sections divided by colored banners, trained marshals in yellow vests maintaining order, medical stations set up at strategic points. Maya's phone buzzed constantly with updates from her coordination team. "East Side reports all clear," she announced, checking her messages. "Counter-protesters are gathering at Pioneer Square, but they're heavily outnumbered, about 200 of them." Reed nodded, his security detail scanning the crowd nervously. The morning sun caught the gray in his hair as he adjusted his collar. No tie again, his bruises still visible as a reminder of why they were here. The crowd below had begun chanting his name, mixing it with calls for justice. At 9:47 a.m., Governor Elena Carter's motorcade arrived. The crowd parted, creating a path to the Capitol steps. Her appearance wasn't on the official schedule, a calculated political risk. Her security team looked uncomfortable, hands near their weapons as she emerged from her vehicle. Carter approached Reed and Maya, cameras capturing every step. She wore a blue suit that deliberately echoed the colors of the reform movement, her expression carefully neutral but determined. "I won't hide in my office while history happens on my doorstep," she said, reaching for Reed's hand. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Cheers mingled with skeptical murmurs. Maya's network of organizers quickly spread the word. "Stay focused. Stay peaceful. This is about justice, not politicians." Then they saw them. 3 blocks away, lines of police officers appeared in full riot gear. They moved in formation, shields up, batons ready. The sight triggered immediate tension in the crowd. Many present had faced similar lines before, with painful consequences. Captain Richards led the police formation, his voice crackling over the radio. "Remember the plan. By the book. No exceptions, no flexibility. Let them see what happens when they reject law and order." The crowd shifted nervously. Some began to retreat, remembering previous confrontations. Others moved forward, phones raised to document everything. The potential for violence hung in the air like static before a storm. Maya grabbed the microphone, her voice carrying over the sound system. "Everyone stay calm. Maintain your positions. Our marshals will guide you. We are not here for confrontation. We are here for change." Governor Carter's security team urged her to leave, but she stood her ground. "If I run now, everything we're trying to build falls apart," she told her chief of security. Instead, she moved to the microphone, aware that her next words could either diffuse or detonate the situation. The police line stopped their advance, creating an artificial boundary 3 blocks from the Capitol steps. Behind their riot shields, officers shifted uncomfortably in the growing heat. Some recognized faces in the crowd, family members, friends, neighbors who had come to demand change. Reed's security detail reported movement on nearby rooftops, police spotters or something else. They couldn't be sure. The crowd continued to grow as more people arrived, drawn by live social media coverage. The space between the protesters and police became a no man's land, filled with tension and possibilities. Everyone present knew they were balancing on a knife's edge. One wrong move, one aggressive action from either side, could trigger exactly the kind of chaos the reform movement had fought to prevent. The next few minutes would determine whether this became another tragedy or a turning point in history. Marcus Reed approached the microphone, his presence silencing the murmurs of the crowd. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Capitol steps as he began to speak, his voice carrying across the sea of faces. "Look around you," he began, gesturing to the crowd. "This is not a protest anymore. This is a movement. When they beat me on those streets, they thought they were silencing one voice. Instead, they awakened thousands." His words echoed off the buildings, broadcast live across every major network. The speech continued, building momentum. "I've spent years in the corridors of power, believing change could come through traditional channels. I was wrong. Real change comes from the ground up, from the people who refuse to accept injustice as normal. Today we stand together, not as victims, but as architects of a new system." Meanwhile, at the edges of the crowd, a group of black-clad individuals began moving through the protesters. Maya's network of marshals spotted them immediately, known agitators who had disrupted peaceful protests before. They carried concealed objects in their backpacks, their intentions clear to experienced organizers. Maya activated her communication network. "Section leaders, we have potential agitators at sectors 7 and 12. Implement Protocol Delta." Her trained volunteers moved swiftly, surrounding the suspicious group with walls of peaceful protesters, effectively isolating them from the main crowd. The agitators found themselves contained, their planned disruption neutralized by strategic crowd management. Maya's team had learned from past protests. Violence could not be allowed to hijack their message. But then Officer Carter, one of the officers who had beaten Reed, broke ranks from the police line. He removed his riot helmet, his face visible to the cameras and crowd. The action sent ripples through both sides of the standoff. His fellow officers shifted uncertainly, while protesters held their breath. Carter walked into the no-man's land between the police line and protesters. His supervisor barked orders through the radio to return to formation, but he continued forward, his movements deliberate and calm. The crowd parted as he approached the Capitol steps. Maya's marshals moved to intercept him, but Reed held up his hand, signaling them to wait. The tension in the air was electric as Carter climbed the steps. He stopped halfway, turned to face both the crowd and his fellow officers, and unclipped his badge. The metallic sound of it hitting the stone steps seemed to echo across the silent square. "I was wrong," his voice cracked with emotion. "We were all wrong. The system didn't make us protectors. It made us afraid. And fear turned us into exactly what these people are protesting against." The moment hung in the air, thousands of phones recording what would become one of the most shared videos of the year. Carter continued, addressing his fellow officers. "Look at them. Really look. These aren't enemies. These are the people we swore to protect." Some officers in the riot line began shifting uncomfortably. A few removed their helmets. The rigid formation began to show cracks of humanity. Maya stepped forward, her presence commanding attention. "This is what courage looks like," she declared, her voice carrying across the square. "Not the courage to stand against people, but the courage to stand for what's right." The crowd's energy transformed, tension giving way to something more powerful: hope. The confrontation that many had feared might turn violent instead became a moment of unexpected unity. The revelation that followed became known as the Carter Confession. Standing before the assembled crowd, his former colleagues and rolling cameras, Officer Carter began detailing a system of institutional pressure and coded orders that had shaped police behavior for decades. Every protest was labeled a threat, he revealed, his voice growing stronger with each word. "We were told our family's safety depended on maintaining control. They showed us edited videos, cherry-picked incidents to make peaceful protesters look like terrorists. Each briefing pushed us further into an us versus them mentality." His testimony, broadcast live across every major network, proved to be the breaking point. Other officers began stepping forward, first one, then three, then a dozen, each adding their voice to the growing chorus of revelations. The thin blue line wasn't just breaking, it was transforming into a bridge. Captain Richards, watching his command crumble, made a desperate grab for his radio. "All units, maintain formation." But his orders fell on deaf ears as more officers removed their riot gear, some crossing the divide to join the protesters. Governor Carter, seizing the historic moment, descended the Capitol steps. With Reed on one side and Maya on the other, she announced the immediate implementation of emergency police reforms. "This is not the end," she declared. "This is the beginning of a complete restructuring of our law enforcement system." The investigation that followed rocked the state's power structure. Dozens of senior police officials were indicted for systematic civil rights violations. The police union leadership, faced with overwhelming evidence of corruption, resigned en masse. Internal documents revealed decades of coordinated suppression and abuse. 3 months later, Marcus Reed stood in the same spot, but under very different circumstances. As the newly appointed head of the Police Reform Commission, he was overseeing the most comprehensive restructuring of law enforcement in state history. Maya Johnson, now the youngest member of the Civil Rights Oversight Committee, worked alongside him. The changes were dramatic and far-reaching. A complete overhaul of police training, emphasizing de-escalation and community service. The establishment of independent civilian review boards with real power. Reallocation of substantial portions of police budgets to community services. Mandatory psychological evaluation and support for officers. New transparency requirements and accountability measures. Officer Carter, having faced consequences for his role in Reed's assault, but praised for his eventual courage, became a key figure in training reform. His testimony helped shape new guidelines for police conduct and culture. On the anniversary of the protest, Reed and Maya stood together at a memorial service for victims of police violence. Maya's brother's name was the first on a new monument, followed by hundreds of others. But now these names represented not just tragedy, but transformation. "My brother used to say that change comes when good people get tired of being afraid," Maya addressed the gathered crowd. "Today, we're not just tired of fear, we're done with it entirely." Reed, his physical scars healed, but the memory still sharp, added his own reflection. "Sometimes it takes a wound to heal a system. What happened to me was tragic, but what came from it was revolutionary. We've proved that justice isn't just a word. It's a reality we can build together." The story of the Voices of Resistance became more than a moment in history. It became a blueprint for change across the nation. Other states began adopting similar reforms, creating a ripple effect of transformation in law enforcement culture nationwide. As the sun set on that anniversary gathering, Maya turned to Reed. "You know, when I wrote that letter to you in the hospital, I never imagined we'd end up here." Reed smiled, watching new recruits training under the reformed system. "Sometimes the best revolutions aren't the ones that tear everything down," he replied. "They're the ones that build something better from the broken pieces." The end of their story marked the beginning of a new chapter in American justice, one written not in violence and fear, but in courage, truth, and the unwavering belief that change is possible when voices unite in resistance. "Officer Carter," Martinez said carefully, "are you suggesting this incident reflects systemic issues rather than individual actions?" "I'm saying we were taught to be warriors instead of guardians. The vice governor's beating wasn't a mistake in protocol. It was protocol working exactly as designed." Carter's voice cracked slightly. "I've got 3 kids at home. They asked me last night if I'm one of the bad cops they see on TV.